The sun shone brightly over the small town market, where local farmers and vendors had set up their stalls. It was a lively place, filled with the sweet smell of fresh fruits, the warm aroma of baked bread, and the cheerful chatter of people buying and selling. Families walked around with baskets in their hands, children ran between the stalls, and the sound of laughter mixed with the calls of vendors advertising their goods. Among the sellers was Frank Dawson, a heavy-set man with a thick beard and kind eyes. He wore a simple flannel shirt, old jeans, and a worn-out hat that shaded his face. His hands were rough from years of working on his farm, but they were steady as he placed ripe tomatoes into a wooden crate. His stall was small but neatly arranged, filled with fresh vegetables he had grown himself. Though he didn't talk much, he was well liked in the market. People knew him as the quiet farmer who never caused trouble. As Frank sorted his produce, the sudden roar of motorcycles echoed through the marketplace. Heads turned as a group of bikers rode in, their engines growling like wild animals. The riders, dressed in dark leather jackets, parked their bikes carelessly in the middle of the market, taking up space where families walked. The noise alone was enough to make some children cover their ears, while a few of the older shoppers frowned in disapproval. The leader of the group, a tall man with sharp eyes, removed his helmet and looked around with a smirk. His name was Ray Reaper Carson, and he was known for making trouble wherever he went. His group followed behind him, laughing loudly as they strolled through the market, pushing aside anyone who didn't move fast enough. Frank barely looked up. He had seen men like this before, loud, full of themselves, always looking for attention. He continued arranging his vegetables, hoping they would just pass by. But luck was not on his side. One of the bikers, a burly man with a thick mustache, spotted Frank's stall and grinned. "Hey, look at this guy," he said loudly, nudging his friend. "Big guy selling little veggies. Ain't that funny?" The others laughed, drawing more attention to themselves. Frank didn't respond. He had dealt with rude people before, and he knew the best way to handle them was to ignore them. But the bikers weren't done. Another one reached out and grabbed a bright red tomato from Frank's stall. He tossed it in the air like a ball before taking a big bite. Juice dripped down his chin, and he wiped it away carelessly. "Not bad," he said. "Maybe we should take a few more on the house." Frank exhaled slowly, his eyes remaining calm, but his fingers tightened around the edge of the wooden crate. He still said nothing. The market crowd grew uneasy. Some people stepped back, whispering to each other, while others hurried to finish their shopping and leave. No one wanted trouble, but they could feel it coming. The bikers laughed louder, pleased that no one was standing up to them. They had no idea that the quiet farmer they were mocking was not just any man. He was Frank Dawson, a retired Delta Force commander, a man trained for combat, a man who had seen more danger than they could ever imagine. But for now, he remained still, waiting. The bikers, still laughing, made themselves comfortable near Frank's stall. They acted as if they owned the place, talking loudly and drawing the attention of nearby shoppers. People who had been looking at fresh vegetables and homemade goods suddenly felt uneasy. Some of the vendors lowered their voices, hoping not to attract trouble. Frank continued working, carefully placing tomatoes in neat rows, pretending not to hear them. But inside, he was paying attention to every movement, every word. His years of training had taught him to stay calm, to assess the situation before acting. One of the bikers, a tall, skinny man with a bandana around his head, leaned against Frank's stall and grinned. "You know, old man, you should say something when guests stop by," he said. "It ain't polite to ignore people." Frank didn't look up. "I don't mind visitors," he said, his voice steady. "But I do mind folks making a mess." The leader, Ray Carson, chuckled and stepped forward. He picked up a bright green pepper and tossed it in the air. "Oh, come on. We're just having a little fun," he said. "No harm in that, right?" Frank didn't answer. He reached down to adjust a basket, his movements slow and controlled. He wasn't afraid. He was simply choosing not to react. The bikers, taking his silence as weakness, decided to push further. One of them, a heavy-set man with tattoos on his arms, grabbed a handful of tomatoes and threw them back into the crate carelessly, squashing one in the process. "Oops," he said, smirking. "Guess that one wasn't too fresh." A few people in the crowd gasped, but no one stepped in. Most of them had seen what happened when troublemakers like these were challenged. It never ended well. Frank still didn't react. He picked up the squashed tomato, inspected it for a moment, then set it aside. His expression didn't change, but those who knew him could see something shift in his posture. Ray Carson crossed his arms. "You're a quiet one, huh? Must be used to folks walking all over you." He laughed and looked around at his friends. "Maybe this guy ain't as tough as he looks." The other bikers laughed, but Frank remained calm. He slowly wiped his hands on a rag and placed it back on the table. A few feet away, Bill Carter, an older man who had been watching the scene unfold, felt his heart beat a little faster. He recognized the way Frank moved, the way his shoulders remained relaxed, the way his eyes stayed focused but calm. It was the stance of a man who had seen things, who had done things. Bill turned to the person next to him and whispered, "They don't know who they're messing with." But the bikers didn't stop. One of them reached out and grabbed Frank's apron, pulling him forward slightly. "Say something, old man," he sneered. Frank let out a slow breath. The bikers thought they were in control. They had no idea what was coming next. The moment the biker grabbed Frank's apron, the entire marketplace seemed to hold its breath. A few shoppers stepped back, unsure of what was about to happen. The vendors, who had been quietly watching, exchanged nervous glances. Frank remained still, his expression unchanged. His rough, calloused hands rested on the wooden table, and his eyes stayed locked on the biker in front of him. He wasn't afraid. He wasn't even angry. He was just waiting. The biker, thinking he had full control, pulled the apron again, this time harder. "I said, say something," he repeated, his voice filled with arrogance. Frank exhaled softly and finally looked up. His deep, steady gaze met the biker's eyes. It wasn't a look of fear, nor was it one of frustration. It was the look of a man who had seen more than his fair share of trouble. A man who had walked through storms and come out the other side. But the bikers didn't see it. They only saw an old, overweight farmer standing in front of them. Another biker, the tall one with the bandana, stepped forward and chuckled. "Maybe he's too scared to talk," he said, nudging Ray Carson. "Maybe he's just some big teddy bear." Ray smirked. "Yeah, maybe," he said. Then, as if to prove his point, he picked up another tomato from the crate and squeezed it in his hand until the juice dripped onto Frank's table. "Guess we'll have to make things a little more interesting." Still, Frank didn't react. He simply watched, his face unreadable. Bill Carter, the old veteran standing nearby, clenched his fists. He knew what was coming. He had seen this kind of patience before, not in farmers, but in soldiers. He had fought alongside men like Frank, men who never raised their voices, never lost their tempers, but when the time came, they moved like lightning. Bill leaned toward a younger man standing next to him and whispered, "They're making a mistake. They don't know who he is." The young man frowned. "Who is he?" Bill didn't answer. Instead, he kept his eyes on Frank, waiting. The situation was growing more intense by the second. The crowd had stopped pretending to shop and was now fully watching. The air was thick with tension, as if the entire market was trapped in a moment that could break at any second. Then, Ray Carson made the biggest mistake of all. With an amused grin, he reached out and gave Frank a light shove on the shoulder. "Come on, old man, do something." It was barely a push. It wasn't hard. It wasn't violent. But it was enough. Frank took a slow, deep breath. His fingers curled slightly, and for the first time, he straightened up to his full height. The bikers had been laughing a moment ago, but now something felt different. They couldn't explain why, but the energy in the air had shifted. It was as if a sleeping bear had just woken up. Frank looked down at his apron, where the biker's hand still rested. Then, with a voice that was calm but carried a weight that made the hairs on the back of people's necks stand up, he finally spoke. "I'll give you one chance to walk away," he said. The laughter stopped. The market went silent. And for the first time that day, the bikers felt something they hadn't expected to feel. Doubt. For the first time since they arrived, the bikers didn't laugh. Something about the way Frank spoke, so calm, so steady, sent a strange feeling through them. It wasn't anger, and it wasn't fear. It was something else, something they couldn't quite place. Ray Carson raised an eyebrow and let out a short chuckle, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling creeping up his spine. "One chance," he repeated, glancing at his friends. "One chance to do what? Walk away from you." The other bikers, though momentarily silent, quickly joined in, laughing again. They still saw Frank as nothing more than a slow-moving, overweight farmer. Ray shook his head and smirked. "Look, old man, I don't think you understand." Before he could finish his sentence, something happened. It was so fast that even the people standing close by barely saw it. Frank's hand moved like a flash of lightning, gripping Ray's wrist with a strength that didn't match his quiet appearance. In one swift motion, he twisted it just enough to make Ray lose his balance and stumble forward. His knees buckled, and he let out a sharp gasp. The laughter stopped again. Ray tried to pull away, but Frank's grip was like iron. He wasn't squeezing hard, just firm enough to let Ray know he was completely in control. The other bikers tensed. A few of them stepped forward, ready to jump in, but something held them back. Maybe it was the way Frank hadn't broken a sweat. Maybe it was the way he hadn't even changed his expression. Or maybe it was the quiet murmurs spreading through the crowd. "That man's not just a farmer," someone whispered. "That's Frank Dawson," Bill Carter said under his breath, shaking his head. "Who?" the younger man beside him asked. Bill exhaled. "Colonel Frank Dawson, Delta Force." The young man's eyes widened. "Wait, Delta Force? Like Special Forces?" Bill nodded. "Not just any soldier, the best of the best." Meanwhile, Ray gritted his teeth and tried again to yank his arm free. But Frank didn't let go. He didn't need to hurt him, just let him feel the difference in strength. After a few tense seconds, Frank finally released him, stepping back as if nothing had happened. Ray staggered a little, his face red with embarrassment, and something else, something close to fear. Frank dusted off his hands and looked at the bikers. "I asked nicely," he said. His voice was still calm, but now there was something behind it. A quiet warning. The bikers exchanged nervous glances. This wasn't what they expected. They had come to the market thinking they could push people around, but now they weren't so sure. Ray clenched his jaw and flexed his fingers. He wanted to save face. He wanted to prove that this was just some fluke. But deep down he knew. Something had just changed, and it wasn't in his favor. Ray Carson took a step back, flexing his fingers as if to shake off the lingering pressure from Frank's grip. He tried to hide it, but the truth was clear. His hand still tingled from the strength of the farmer's hold. He wasn't used to being manhandled, especially not by someone he had underestimated. His friends shifted uneasily. The mood had changed. A few minutes ago, they were the loudest ones in the market, laughing and making fun of the big, slow-moving farmer. Now the crowd was watching in complete silence, waiting to see what would happen next. Ray's pride burned inside him. He wasn't the type to back down. He had a reputation, and he wasn't about to let some old man embarrass him in front of his crew. He clenched his jaw and forced a grin. "All right," he said, trying to sound amused. "You got some strong hands, old man. But let's see how well you move." Before anyone could react, Ray lunged forward, aiming to shove Frank hard in the chest. But Frank wasn't there. In the blink of an eye, the big farmer had stepped to the side, moving with a speed that didn't match his size. Ray's own momentum betrayed him, sending him stumbling forward. He barely caught himself before falling. Gasps rippled through the crowd. The other bikers looked stunned. How had this slow, heavy-set farmer moved so fast? Ray spun around, his face red with frustration. He charged again, throwing a wild punch. This time, Frank didn't move away. Instead, he caught Ray's arm mid-swing, stopping it with almost no effort. Ray struggled, trying to pull free, but Frank held firm. Then, with the simplest motion, just a slight twist of the wrist, Ray lost his balance again and dropped to one knee. The marketplace was dead silent. Frank let go and took a step back. His voice was still calm, still steady. "I don't like fighting," he said, "but I don't let people push me around either." Ray scrambled to his feet, breathing heavily. His hands were shaking, not from pain, but from something worse. Humiliation. His crew watched, uncertain. No one had ever seen Ray struggle like this before. A few of them shifted uncomfortably, as if realizing, for the first time, that maybe they had made a mistake. Frank turned back to his stall and began picking up a few of the tomatoes that had been knocked over earlier. It was as if nothing had happened. As if this was just another normal day at the market. The people watching from the crowd exchanged glances. Some of them smiled, others whispered among themselves. But one thing was clear. Frank Dawson was not just an ordinary farmer. And the bikers were finally beginning to understand. Ray Carson stood frozen, his breathing heavy, his pride wounded. He had never been in a situation like this before. All his life, he had relied on fear to control people. Wherever he and his gang went, they did what they wanted, and no one dared to stop them. But today was different. The man standing in front of him wasn't afraid. In fact, he hadn't even broken a sweat. Frank Dawson quietly continued picking up his vegetables, as if nothing had happened. His movements were slow and steady, his face calm. He wasn't angry. He wasn't mocking them. He simply didn't see them as a real threat. And somehow, that made it even worse. Ray's crew looked at him, waiting for his next move. But for the first time, Ray didn't know what to do. His hands were still shaking slightly, and he hated that the crowd had seen it. One of his bikers, the tall man with the bandana, stepped closer. "Ray," he muttered just loud enough for him to hear. "This guy, he's not normal." Ray clenched his jaw. He knew that. He had felt it. But he couldn't just walk away, not after all this. He had to do something. Trying to regain control, Ray forced a smirk. "All right, old man," he said, dusting off his jacket. "You've got some moves. I'll give you that." Frank didn't respond. He simply continued stacking the tomatoes in his crate, as if Ray's words didn't matter. That made Ray even angrier. He turned to the people watching and pointed at Frank. "You all think this guy's some kind of hero?" he asked, his voice louder now. "He got lucky, that's all." Nobody answered. The crowd just stared at him, their expressions unreadable. Some of them were smiling slightly, as if they already knew how this would end. Ray looked back at Frank and took a step forward. "You're nothing special," he spat. "Just a big old farmer." "Oh." Frank finally looked up, and in that moment, something in his eyes made Ray stop mid-sentence. It wasn't anger. It wasn't even mourning. It was certainty. Like a man who had faced much bigger threats before, and walked away every time. Ray swallowed hard, suddenly feeling small. He could fight back. He could try again. But deep down, he knew he would lose. Frank said nothing. He didn't have to. Ray looked around at his gang, at the people watching, and at the expectant faces waiting for his next move. Then, with a grunt of frustration, he turned away. "Let's go," he muttered under his breath. His bikers hesitated for a second, but then one by one, they followed. They knew better than to argue. As they walked back to their bikes, Ray clenched his fists. His pride was shattered. But more than that, a single thought ran through his mind. Who was this man? Ray Carson walked toward his bike, his face tight with frustration. His crew followed behind him, glancing back at Frank with uncertain eyes. The market, which had been filled with tension just moments ago, was now calm. Frank, as always, remained quiet. He continued arranging his vegetables as if nothing unusual had happened. His steady hands placed each tomato carefully, and his face showed no emotion. It was as if the encounter with the bikers was nothing more than a small interruption in his day. The crowd was still watching, whispering among themselves. Some of them had recognized Frank's name after Bill Carter mentioned it. Others didn't know his past, but they could see that he wasn't an ordinary man. Bill stepped closer to Frank and let out a small chuckle. "You haven't changed much, have you?" Frank finally looked up and gave a small smile. "I like to think I have," he said. "I don't get into fights anymore." Bill laughed. "Could have fooled me." Frank shook his head. That wasn't a fight. He glanced at Ray and his gang, who were now standing by their bikes, still deciding whether to leave or not. That was just a lesson. Ray clenched his jaw. He heard every word. He had never felt this kind of humiliation before. He had lost fights before, but this was different. He wasn't just beaten, he was ignored. It was as if Frank didn't even see him as a real challenge. One of his men, the tall one with the bandana, leaned in. "Ray," he said quietly, "let's just go. We're not winning this one." Ray exhaled sharply, trying to push down his pride. He hated this feeling, but deep inside, he knew his friend was right. He turned back to Frank, his voice low but sharp. "You think you're better than us, old man." Frank didn't look up. "I don't think about you at all," he said simply. The words hit harder than any punch. The crowd murmured again. A few of them even smiled, shaking their heads. Ray's face turned red, but he had no comeback. No excuse. No power in this situation. With one last glare, he swung his leg over his bike and started the engine. His crew did the same, though some of them looked almost relieved to be leaving. The engines roared as the bikers sped away, kicking up dust as they disappeared down the road. The market slowly returned to normal. People started talking again, moving from stall to stall, but their eyes still flickered toward Frank every now and then. Bill crossed his arms. "You could have handled that differently, you know." Frank smirked. "I did handle it." Bill chuckled. "You always were a quiet one, even back in the old days." Frank's smile faded slightly, but he nodded. "The old days are gone," he said, "and I'd like to keep it that way." But as he turned back to his vegetables, he couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over yet. The dust settled as the bikers disappeared down the road, but the feeling of what had just happened lingered in the air. People at the market slowly returned to their usual business, but there was an energy, an unspoken understanding that they had just witnessed something important. Frank Dawson, the quiet farmer who most people had only seen selling vegetables, was not an ordinary man. Bill Carter stood beside Frank's stall, watching him as he continued arranging his produce like nothing had happened. Bill shook his head with a small smile. "I don't think they'll be coming back anytime soon." Frank sighed. "Let's hope not." Bill studied him for a moment. "You know, there was a time when you have handled that very differently," he said. "Back in the service, you never let a threat walk away." Frank's hands paused for just a second before he continued working. "That was a long time ago," he said. "I'm not that man anymore." Bill nodded. He understood. Some men carried their past with them like a badge of honor. Others, like Frank, carried it like a weight they were trying to put down. The market slowly returned to its usual rhythm. Customers came and went, chatting with vendors, picking out fresh vegetables, and exchanging smiles. The moment of tension had passed, but the respect for Frank had grown. People who had once seen him as just a farmer now saw something more. As the afternoon sun started to lower in the sky, Frank took a deep breath. He looked around at the people, at the peaceful life he had built for himself. This was what he wanted. Quiet days, simple work, no trouble. But trouble had a way of finding people like him. A young boy, no older than 12, ran up to his stall, out of breath. His eyes were wide with urgency. "Mr. Dawson," he called. Frank turned, his expression calm but curious. "What is it, son?" The boy swallowed hard and pointed down the road. "I saw them. The bikers. They stopped just outside of town. They're talking to more people. Bigger guys, I think. I think they're coming back." A hush seemed to settle over the nearby vendors who heard the boy's words. Bill stiffened. "I knew it wasn't over," he muttered. Frank didn't react right away. He finished placing the last of the tomatoes in the crate, wiped his hands on his apron, and looked toward the horizon. Then, for the first time that day, his eyes changed. They weren't the eyes of a farmer anymore. They were the eyes of a man who had been through war. He exhaled slowly and looked at Bill. "Looks like I'll have to teach them one more lesson." Bill grinned. "I was hoping you'd say that." As the sun cast long shadows over the market, Frank Dawson straightened up. The peaceful farmer was still there, but so was the man he used to be. And if the bikers were foolish enough to return, they were about to learn exactly who they had messed with.